Phoebe was never really there. Friends is built around 6 people who share their lives across 10 seasons of coffee, apartments, and crisis. The theory that permanently disturbs how the show looks on rewatch says one of those 6 was never actually there. Phoebe Buffet, the theory argues, is a homeless woman who has been observing the other 5 from the street outside Central Perk for the entire run of the show, constructing an elaborate fantasy of belonging from a position she was never actually invited into. The evidence the theory builds on is structural rather than episodic. Phoebe's connection to the other 5 is the weakest and most inconsistently explained of any member of the group. She has no professional overlap with any of them. Her backstory involves genuine homelessness before the show begins, a fact the show confirms in dialogue about her years living on the street. Her behavior in the group is consistently slightly off-center, as though she is performing what she imagines belonging looks like, rather than simply belonging. The show's opening credits, which show the 6 friends playing in a fountain under colorful umbrellas, map onto a specific image of a homeless woman taking shelter from rain under whatever covering she can find. The theory was dismissed by co-creator Marta Kaufman as insane when it reached her. But the dismissal doesn't address what the theory actually points to. Phoebe's knowledge of the others' lives comes in fragments. Her presence is never fully explained. And the warmth the other 5 show her is occasionally tinged with the specific gentleness people reserve for someone they're not quite sure is entirely grounded in the same reality they're occupying. Gilligan trapped everyone deliberately. Gilligan's Island ran for 3 seasons on CBS from 1964 to 1967 and spent its entire run staging the same premise. 7 castaways stranded on an island, every rescue attempt failing at the last moment. The situation resetting between episodes with cheerful indifference to the accumulated evidence that these people should have been found by now. The theory built around the show's central dynamic says the rescue failures were never accidents. They were Gilligan's interventions. The show stages Gilligan's role in each failed rescue as comedic incompetence, a lovable fool whose clumsiness undermines the skipper's plans. But the theory tracks what Gilligan actually does across 3 seasons and finds a pattern too consistent to attribute to stupidity alone. Every time rescue becomes genuinely imminent, Gilligan is the one who disrupts it. Every time a signal is ready to fire, Gilligan is in the wrong position. Every time a raft is built and tested, Gilligan introduces the specific variable that makes it fail. 3 seasons of catastrophically consistent failure at rescue, all channeled through one man, requires either the most spectacular, sustained bad luck in fictional history or something the show was never willing to name directly. The theory says Gilligan was happy on the island. The other 6 were miserable. And a man who had never in his previous life belonged anywhere, who had found 6 people who depended on him completely and whom he would lose the moment they were rescued, made a decision in the pilot episode that the show spent 3 seasons staging as comedy. He kept them there, not out of malice, out of the only love he had ever been capable of expressing. Zach Morris was a sociopath. Saved by the Bell is one of the most nostalgically beloved teen sitcoms in American television history. Its bright colors and cheerful conflicts remembered fondly by a generation that grew up watching it on Saturday mornings. The theory that dismantles that nostalgia comprehensively says the show's protagonist, Zach Morris, is the most casually depicted sociopath in network television history, and that the show asked its young audience to identify with and root for him across 6 seasons without ever acknowledging what his behavior actually constituted. The evidence assembled across the College Humor series, Zach Morris is Trash, which cataloged the most disturbing individual Zach behaviors by episode, maps a character who manipulates his friends instrumentally, uses romantic relationships as tools for social advancement without any evident genuine feeling, exploits the vulnerabilities of people who trust him for personal gain, and faces no meaningful consequences for any of it across the show's entire run. His ability to pause time, the show's signature supernatural device, is the theory's most disturbing element. A man who can freeze the world around him without the knowledge or consent of anyone in it, who uses that power to assess situations, plan manipulations, and position himself advantageously, is not a charming teen protagonist. He is a being operating outside the ethical constraints that apply to everyone around him, doing so invisibly, and experiencing no moral conflict about the gap between what he appears to be and what he actually is. The The show gave a generation of children a sociopath as their aspirational hero and packaged him in a varsity jacket. Full House Tanner girls were never healthy. Full House presents itself as one of the warmest family sitcoms in television history. A widowed father, raising 3 daughters, with the help of 2 male friends, whose presence fills the emotional space the missing mother left behind. The show's specific warmth, its insistence on resolution within 30 minutes, its refusal to let any episode's conflict produce lasting damage, is exactly what the theory uses to build its disturbing case. 3 girls growing up in a household with no mother, 3 adult men with no parenting credentials or experience, and a show format that requires every emotional crisis to be resolved by the credits, do not produce psychologically healthy children. The theory tracks each sister's behavior across 8 seasons and finds specific, consistent patterns that developmental psychology would identify as trauma responses rather than character quirks. J's controlling perfectionism and disordered relationship with food, the show's one instance of genuinely dark material that it handled and then dropped, is the most cited evidence. Stephanie's compulsive humor, deployed every time the family approaches emotional territory that might require sustained engagement, is the theory's second anchor. Michelle's entitlement and difficulty accepting limits, which the show codes as adorable precociousness, is the third. The theory says Full House was accidentally documenting the outcomes of children raised without adequate emotional modeling, resolved each episode's symptoms without ever addressing their cause, and then sent its young audience home, believing that a hug in the living room and a sentimental speech from Danny constituted the kind of parenting these children actually needed. The Fresh Prince's Carlton was never safe. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is understood culturally as a show about class, identity, and the collision between Will Smith's West Philadelphia background and the Banks family's upper-class Los Angeles life. Carlton Banks is remembered as the show's comic foil, the preppy, conservative cousin whose enthusiastic assimilation into elite culture provides reliable contrast against Will's streetwise perspective. The theory built around Carlton's actual psychological arc across 6 seasons says the show was depicting something considerably darker than a sheltered rich kid who loved Tom Jones. Carlton Banks is a black man in 1990s America who has constructed an identity around performing whiteness so completely that the performance has consumed everything underneath it. The show stages this as comedy. The theory reads it as survival. Carlton's dancing, his golf obsession, his academic overachievement, his visible discomfort in environments coded as specifically black, all of it maps onto the behavior of someone who has learned, at a young enough age, that the lesson is now structural rather than conscious, that assimilation is protection. The episode in which Carlton takes diet pills to enhance his athletic performance and experiences a medical crisis is the theory's most cited evidence. A young man willing to damage himself physically to compete in a space where his identity already requires constant performance is not simply a sheltered kid making a bad decision. He is someone whose relationship to his own body and its adequacy has been warped by a childhood spent performing adequacy for people whose approval he has never been able to fully secure. Urkel created Steve to survive. Family Matters is built around the Winslow family, a functional, warm Chicago household whose lives are repeatedly disrupted by their neighbor Steve Urkel, a lanky, nasal-voiced teenage genius whose obsessive crush on Laura Winslow drives most of the show's comedy. The theory built around Urkel's specific character details says the Steve Urkel the Winslows interact with is not who Steve Urkel actually is. It is a character Steve built in childhood to survive a domestic environment, the show reveals, across multiple episodes, as genuinely neglectful and occasionally abusive. Steve's parents are absent, dismissive, and documented across the series as having abandoned him in every meaningful sense while maintaining technical guardianship. The suspenders, the high-water pants, the nasal voice, the hyper-intellectual affect, all of it is the armor of a child who constructed a persona so specific and so completely rendered that it functioned as both a social identity and a barrier between himself and the reality of his home life. The persona is impenetrable because it was never designed to communicate. It was designed to protect. Laura's consistent rejection of Urkel, which the show stages as comedy across multiple seasons, is the theory's most disturbing element in this reading. Steve built a character whose primary motivation was being loved by one specific person, and then, That person spent years confirming that even the character, the most complete and defended version of himself Steve had available, wasn't enough. He eventually invents a machine to transform himself into Stefan Urkel, a confident, conventionally attractive alter ego. The theory says Stefan isn't a machine's product. He's who Steve always wanted to be before he built Urkel to survive not being him. Roseanne's family never actually made it. Roseanne is widely considered television's most honest portrait of working-class American family life, a show that spent 8 seasons depicting financial precarity, marital friction, and the specific texture of surviving in a household where money is always slightly insufficient and the margin for error is always slightly too small. The Season 9 finale's revelation that Roseanne had been writing a fictionalized version of events while processing Dan's real death retroactively reframed the entire season as grief-driven fantasy. The theory built around this structural revelation says the reframing doesn't stop at Season 9. If Roseanne is writing fiction to survive loss, the threshold between what is real within the show and what is her constructed version is not established by the Season 9 premiere. The theory maps specific turning points in earlier seasons where the family situation becomes measurably better than the show's own established financial reality should allow. Moments where Roseanne's universe nudges towards something slightly more comfortable or slightly more resolved than the 8 seasons of specific, documented working-class precarity should produce. Every convenience that came slightly too easily, every resolution that arrived slightly too cleanly, could be Roseanne at her writing desk, choosing the version of events she needed rather than the version that actually happened. Dan's heart attack, the theory says, was not a Season 9 plot development. It was the event around which the entire preceding 8 seasons were eventually revealed to be organized. The most realistic family sitcom ever made may have been a widow's tribute to a marriage she was still trying to figure out how to survive without. How I Met Your Mother was always a grief story. The theory about How I Met Your Mother's fundamental structure, which the show's own finale confirmed and which the audience rejected so completely that the production team released an alternate ending to address the rejection, says the show was always a grief story and that the audience's resistance to the finale was a resistance to processing what the show had actually been doing for 9 seasons. The mother dies. Ted tells his children her story. The story takes 9 seasons because the story is not really about the mother. It is about Ted learning to survive her loss, told in the form he could manage, which was also the form that allowed him to preserve her for the length of its telling. Every digression, every tangent, every story, within a story that frustrated audiences for 9 seasons is Ted keeping his wife alive in the only medium available to him after she was gone. The theory says the finale's most disturbing detail is not the death itself, but the children's response. They tell Ted to go after Robin. They push him toward moving on. 2 children who just heard their father spend 9 seasons describing how much he loved their mother respond to the story of that love by immediately redirecting him towards someone else. The theory says that response is the confirmation. Ted didn't just tell his children a love story. He told them a love story specifically structured to arrive at the question he needed them to answer. Whether it was okay to love someone else now. The children's answer was yes. The story was always asking them to give it. The Nanny was always a hostage situation. The Nanny ran for 6 seasons on CBS and is remembered warmly as a fish-out-of-water comedy about Fran Fine, a working-class Queenswoman who becomes nanny to the wealthy Sheffield children and eventually wins the heart of their sophisticated British father. The theory built around the show's actual domestic structure says the comedy framing concealed something considerably more disturbing about Fran's position within the Sheffield household. Fran arrives at the Sheffield home without an appointment, without credentials, without references, and without any formal qualification for the position she is immediately given access to. She is admitted to the inner domestic life of a grieving widower with 3 children, with the same vetting process that might apply to someone selling magazine subscriptions. She then spends 6 seasons embedded in that household, financially dependent on it, socially contained by it, and romantically entangled with its patriarch in ways that the show presents as a slow-burn romance, but the theory reads as an extreme power imbalance. With nowhere for Fran to exit, she has no alternative income. She has no established professional identity outside the Sheffield home by the show's later seasons. Her family, while present, is depicted as a source of embarrassment rather than genuine support. The Sheffield household is not simply her employer. It is her entire world, increasingly, as the seasons progress, and the romance that develops within it cannot be fully consensual in the conventional sense when one party holds complete economic and social power over the other's survival. The show ended with a wedding. The theory says the wedding was the only exit available. Married with Children was America's Real Family. Married with Children premiered in 1987 as Fox's first original programming and spent 11 seasons depicting the Bundy family with a specific, sustained contempt for the aspirational domestic warmth that defined every other family sitcom of its era. Al is exhausted, underpaid, and vocally resentful of his marriage and family. Peg is checked out, dismissive, and operating from a position of complete disengagement from conventional domestic responsibility. Kelly is coded as intellectually limited in ways the show exploits for comedy without examining. Bud is overlooked and desperate for validation he never receives. The theory built around the Bundys says the show was the most honest family sitcom ever made, and that the contempt it depicted was not a comedic exaggeration, but an accurate portrait of what American working-class family life actually looked like in the 1980s for a specific demographic that every other sitcom had decided wasn't worth showing. Al Bundy, selling shoes for 20 years while his family takes his labor entirely for granted, is not a punchline. It is a documentary. The bitterness he expresses every episode is not a character quirk written for shock, contrast against the era's warmth. It is the specific, sustained exhaustion of a man who made decisions at 20 that he is still paying for at 40, in a culture that told him the decisions would produce something different from what they produced. The laugh track on Married with Children performed the same function as the laugh track on every other sitcom. It told the audience when to be comfortable. The theory says the discomfort was always the more accurate response. Everybody Hates Chris was lived experience played straight. Everybody Hates Chris is framed as a semi-autobiographical comedy about Chris Rock's childhood in Brooklyn in the 1980s, narrated by Rock as an adult looking back on the specific indignities of being a black teenager bused to a predominantly white school, supporting his family financially through part-time work, and navigating a domestic environment defined by poverty's specific daily pressures. The show's comedy is real, and the performances are warm. The theory built around what the show is actually documenting says the comedy is the most disturbing element rather than the most reassuring one. Chris, who is between 13 and 16 across the show's run, works multiple jobs to supplement the family's income. He is regularly physically disciplined in ways the show codes as cultural context. He is consistently humiliated at school by students, and occasionally by teachers, without the institutional support that should exist to address it. He travels alone through Brooklyn, at ages where modern child welfare standards would identify his independence as a supervision concern. And the show's laugh track, Rock's comedic narration, and the performance's warmth all function as framing devices that ask the audience to receive each of these elements as charming period detail, rather than the documented record of a child bearing loads that adults were failing to carry for him. The theory says Everybody Hates Chris was the most honest show about childhood poverty ever produced for American network television, and that its comedy was the only format available to tell that specific story to an audience that wouldn't have watched it without the laugh track telling them it was okay to enjoy it.